You're listening to episode 21 of The Secular Buddhist. Does this mean we can vote now? Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Although early Buddhism certainly acknowledges the equality of women in ability to attain liberation, and even went so far as to start an ordination for women as monastics, the actual equality of women is, in practice, something which has suffered from cultural biases and age-old views. Nuns, even those with tremendous experience and knowledge to share, find themselves relegated to a role of subservience to even the most inexperienced of their male counterparts. Recent events regarding the ordination of bhikkhunis has brought into sharp focus how deeply these divisions lie, and how equality of capability does not correspond to equality of responsibility. Is this changing? Certainly there is more attention to it, and hopefully venues like this podcast can help move things in a direction more in keeping with modern views of equality and partnership. My guest today is author and Buddhist scholar Rita Gross. Rita specializes in bringing together the values and perspectives of academic research and Buddhist teachings, and is internationally known for her innovative work on gender and religion. And we're here with Rita Gross. Rita, thank you so much for being here.
Well, hello. Glad to be here.
So if you could tell our listeners, what is your background and how did you come to having a Buddhist practice?
Well, it's a fairly complicated story, and I've written about it several times, most recently in my most recently published book, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I came from an impoverished background from northern Wisconsin. Not the kind of situation where you wind up going to the University of Chicago and getting a PhD in the history of religions, but by sheer good luck and scholarships, I was able to do that. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, but I decided not to go on in philosophy because that didn't really seem to get at the heart of things. And it seemed to me that religion was much more really at the heart of what matters to people. But even in the early 1960s, I graduated from college in 65, started graduate school that same year. It seemed very obvious to me that it was kind of short-sighted only to study the religions found in one's own culture.
Yes, very.
As you know, in 1965, there was not much presence of any of the Asian religions in North America, except among Asian immigrant communities, which were much, much smaller than they are now. So this was kind of a strange decision for a 21-year-old from northern Wisconsin to make, but I did it. So, and I got into the University of Chicago. In fact, it was the only school I applied to because I was too poor to afford application fees to a lot of fancy universities. I came in with scholarships and had scholarships all the way through, and I knew that I was going to be studying a field called history of religions, which most people would recognize more as comparative religion, specializing in what was then called non-Western religions. I decided early on to specialize in India, so I started learning Sanskrit. And early on, I was actually much more interested in Hinduism than I was in Buddhism. And the books that were available on Buddhism at that time really weren't very good, though I did get quite interested in Tantra, both Hindu and Buddhist Tantra, and I did read practically all the books that were available in the late 60s. And I got out of graduate school and started teaching actually in 1970, and had a few rocky years, a lot of personal turmoil. I was teaching Buddhism to university students, but, I didn't really have that good a background in Buddhism at that time. In 1973, I moved to Eau Claire, where I've lived ever since, and I was not happy about the move. I was not happy about coming back to more of a backwater place. The person I was in love with had a terminal illness, so life was very, very grim. And I was teaching a course on Buddhism. And in the middle of that set of circumstances, I was trying to prepare a lecture on the Four Noble Truths and really trying to figure out what this set of teachings, which seems so backwards to so many people when they first hear them, what this set of teachings meant. And in the middle of my own great unhappiness and trying to understand these Four Noble Truths so I could give a decent lecture on them, it became quite clear to me that they were in fact true. And that was a very sudden kind of great clarification. And that was the point at which I decided to find a meditation teacher and learn to meditate and take up Buddhism as a serious personal pursuit, which I had not at all done before that. So it's one of the reasons why I always emphasize really studying and learning and contemplating with my students, because I had never heard a Buddhist teacher teach. I hadn't read any Dharma books. Just really knowing what the basic teachings said and trying to understand them was the spark that lit everything up for me.
Yeah.
So that's how I came to Buddhism. By that time, I had already done a lot of work on women and religion. I had made some fairly important discoveries in my field and was well on the way to doing some serious critique of my field for its total, the word we use is androcentrism, a totally male-centered model of humanity in which women were not interesting as subjects in their own right and were never studied as subjects in their own right. They were only studied as what men thought about them. And that was very controversial. It seems so obvious, but it was very, very controversial when we first started saying, just a minute, women are human beings and women do have subjectivity and women do have religious lives of their own. They're not just players in the lives of men. We need to study women's lives for their own sake, not as how they relate to men or how men think about them. So that was really, from my point of view, what the early feminist movement, feminist theology was about. And I developed that work a lot. So I had two strands going on, the feminist paradigm shift and then my own practice of Buddhism. And those are the streams that came together in what's probably still my most important book, Buddhism After Patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of your books, you're the author of many books, including Religious Feminism and the Future of the Planet, Soaring and Settling, Buddhist Perspectives on Contemporary Social and Religious Issues, and many others. What motivates you to write about the topics that you choose?
It's a combination of looking for what seems to be the case, what really seems to be true, and wanting to help other people think about those issues. So most of the work that I have done, in one way or another, has circled around gender, whether it's been more academic scholarship on the role of women in religion, whether it's been my advocacy work in Buddhism and the role of women in Buddhism. It's all, in one way or another, circled around the topic of gender, because I really do think that one of the most painful things we've done to ourselves is paint ourselves into what I call the prison of gender roles, which is this set of conventional expectations about what men should be like and what they should want, and what women should be like and what they should want, which doesn't seem to hold up in real life at all. I mean, I've never fit into the conventional female gender role at all, and most people I know don't really fit into a stereotypical gender role, and yet we still continue to hang on to them. Perhaps less today than when I was being socialized in the 50s, but I certainly don't see that they're gone either.
Yeah, I don't either, and that seems to be an issue that it continues and is prevalent in our modern society, and I would expect that there are not enough people studying that problem as you are.
Yeah. Well, and those of us who have studied it seriously and full-time for a long time have really been marginalized, especially in the field of religious studies. There's a very flourishing feminist studies and religion movement, but very few of the key people in that movement ever got really good academic positions. We were not really able to influence the next generation of scholars except through our books. It's been very, very difficult taking up being that voice, whether in the academy or in the Buddhist world. It's been very, very difficult.
What do you see as the biggest challenge women face, particularly in Buddhism today?
Today? Well, actually, this is not going to be such a feminist answer. I think the biggest challenge women face is the same as the biggest challenge men face, and that is actually being well enough trained to become reliable teachers of the way. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to really understand what Buddha Dharma is about and become a competent and capable teacher of the way. As you probably know, among Western Buddhists, almost half or about half of the people who are active teachers these days are women. And this is unprecedented. This is a completely new situation in the Buddhist world. This was never the case in any form of Asian Buddhism. So this is really a very, very important step. And I've often said that I think it's the karma of Western Buddhists to do something about the really not very laudatory record of traditional Buddhism and its gender practices. That Western Buddhists really need to take this job up and do it right. And I would say we're doing a halfway decent job of it, but on the other hand, there's still also a lot of complacency. People still make fun of Buddhist feminists in the Western world. They still kind of roll their eyes and say, oh, there she goes again. Why can't we just, be nice? Why do we have to talk about these thorny, difficult issues?
And that's precisely why we need to, is because they are thorny, difficult issues.
They're thorny, difficult issues, and even Buddhists would much rather be comfortable than really get to the root of what causes suffering. Now, the last piece I finished writing, which will be coming out in the next issue of Inquiring Mind, is a piece called How Clinging to Gender Subverts Enlightenment. And I think, that's the topic that people don't really want to look at. On the one hand, with so many women being quite well trained and working as teachers, we've made some great steps forward in Western Buddhism. But on the other hand, we really do need to look at how clinging to gender subverts enlightenment, and how if we don't undo this prison of gender roles really thoroughly, even having women teachers won't really make any difference in any fundamental way.
Yeah, and I agree with you that we have, right now in particular, a wonderful opportunity to shed some of the limitations and perhaps cultural or wherever they're coming from, limitations and preconceived notions we've had that are hampering progress of the teaching itself, of putting it into practice. So one thing I wanted to ask you in particular, based on your scholarship, is that the history of women in Buddhism may not be very well known even among those who practice. Can you tell us about the role of women in early Buddhism and how that's evolved over time?
Well, that will take quite a while if we were to do it very thoroughly. It's something that I've studied a lot and I've written a lot about it. So if people want to know more than we're going to cover in a few minutes, they could look at my books, and especially, again, Buddhism After Patriarchy. You're right that the history of women in Buddhism is not well known, certainly not well known among Western practitioners, because of a superficial equality in Western Buddhism, and because women do meditate alongside men and do teach classes and do get trained. A lot of my Buddhist friends basically are incredulous, and they say, "Well, there's no sexism problem in Buddhism, Rita." So what are you talking about? And they don't know any Buddhist history. They simply don't know Buddhist history. This is one of my big gripes about Western practitioners, is that they do not know anything about traditional Buddhism, and they don't like to study Buddhist history, which means that there's a lot of superficiality to a lot of what they understand about Buddhism. As for there's no problem of gender in Buddhism, I often tell to me it's a very humorous story. It happened to me in 1980. I gave the first talk I had ever given on Buddhism and gender, Buddhism and feminism, at an international Buddhist Christian dialogue conference in Hawaii. And I was going to be a keynote speaker giving a talk titled Buddhism and Feminism. It was an international conference. There were a lot of male Japanese delegates there who wouldn't talk to me, but they did talk to my American male friends, who then came back to me and said what they were saying. And what they were saying is something like, "That crazy American woman, what is her problem?" Now, we can understand that Christian women might think there's some sort of a sexism problem. After all the priests are men, and God is a man, Jesus was a man. But we Buddhists, we took care of that problem long ago. According to Buddhism, deserving women are reborn as men. So there's no problem.
And they're saying there's no problem while refusing to speak to you directly.
Yes. Well, maybe it was a language thing, a cultural thing. Who knows what it was? But anyway, they wouldn't, they couldn't talk to me directly about it. So I always tell that story when I give a talk on gender and Buddhism, or Buddhism and feminism, because pretty much that has been the classical Asian solution to the problem of gender. Women should get reborn as men, and then they'll be able to do all the stuff men can do. Now, one of the things I like to point out about that statement, Western women are, really horribly hurt and put off by that statement. It's infuriating to Western women to be told that our problem is that we're not men, and when we do become men, everything will be okay. But what that statement is saying, half of that statement is that life for females in a male-dominated patriarchal system is really, really horrible. That they're admitting that women suffer under male dominance. But what they don't see, it seemed easier somehow for people to think about changing women into men in a future life than to change the society that made life as a woman so unbearable and so difficult. And perhaps, I always try to give the benefit of the doubt to things. Perhaps without, for one thing, reliable birth control, women's lives are pretty unpredictable and pretty miserable. Women were primed for basically one thing for the most part, and that was reproduction and child rearing. They weren't educated. It was just thought that, that was what women could do, and that made their lives they were too burdened with their domestic duties to have any time for anything else, whereas men could take the time for other things. So this is a complicated answer, and it's a big question. I want to go back to early Buddhism. Actually, in very early Buddhism, the situation for women may not have been as bad as people often think it is. There is a very famous, very well-known story. It's pretty well known even to many Western Buddhists about how the Buddha didn't really want to ordain the nun sangha. He didn't really want to let women become nuns, and he was only convinced to, and his foster mother basically ordained herself, and his favorite disciple, Ananda, finally took up the case of the women. What I say about that, though, is the Buddha first said no, and then later on he said yes. So this is one of the few, perhaps the only example we have was the Buddha actually changing his mind.
Yeah.
In the face of a good argument, to which I say, well, if the Buddha is our role model and the Buddha could change his mind about how he thought about gender, then anybody else should be able to as well.
Why can't the rest of us?
Yeah, like the rest of us. So this is actually quite a good role model in many ways. There's also, if you really want to go into the ins and outs of textual study and textual analysis, some scholars have proposed that whole story was probably an interpolation that was inserted into those stories at a later date. Because the story also says, well, if the women hadn't become nuns, my religion would have lasted for 1,000 years, but now it's only going to last for 500 years. And about 500 years was when Buddhism really was starting to have very major sectarian conflicts between the earlier forms of Buddhism and the emerging Mahayana forms. So it may have been somebody said, oh, if it hadn't been for those women.
Yeah, the clock has run out. It's their fault.
Yeah. And of course we can say, well, it's well more than 2,500 years since the Buddha taught and lived, and his religion is still around. So, what about the prediction it would only last for 1,000 years? That apparently wasn't correct either. In the early Buddhist texts, there are many, many stories of women who became enlightened equally with the men. Their stories have been collected into a text called the Therigatha, the Songs of the Women Elders, which is something I very, very highly recommend. And, in early Buddhism, women really, their stories are plentiful, that women really could become enlightened and become equally accomplished as their male counterparts. People often think that with the beginnings of Mahayana Buddhism, the situation of women improved, but nowadays scholars are actually beginning to doubt that, and that it was more in Mahayana Buddhism that the belief became very strong that women could not become enlightened, but that they first had to be reborn as men before they could become enlightened. And that belief runs pretty thoroughly through the Mahayana texts. The one I'm reading right now, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Sanskrit version of that sutra, not the Pali one, says very, very clearly that it is never the case that a bodhisattva, mahasattva, attains supreme bodhi as a female.
And that concept of in order for a woman to spiritually grow, they have to be reborn as a male, that's just the magic excuse card for maintaining the status quo of inequality.
Right, because, who knows what's the cause and what's the effect, but once you've got that intellectual, ideological system in place, you don't have to do anything about injustice and oppression because it's going to be taken care of in the future.
Yeah, and those of us who are in the secular side of a modern Buddhist practice where there is a degree of skepticism about things like rebirth, there's less receptivity to next life will take care of it. Even if one
I mean, I'm agnostic. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical about rebirth. I would say I'm agnostic. I just don't know. But even if, there is a very strong possibility of rebirth, there's no reason, because one's future rebirth depends on what one is able to do in this life. If you put all sorts of limitations around women, you're also limiting what their future rebirths could be.
Right, which is not an act of compassion and kindness.
It still doesn't solve the problem. Now, to show what kinds of repercussions this can have, I'll tell a story about a person, a woman I know. I won't even say where she's from, but she was studying with a teacher I study with, and we were being taught a physically challenging practice that is usually done by teenagers. And we were, in our 50s, middle-aged and somewhat overweight in many cases. And this is a practice that takes a light body. There was a Tibetan monk there who was assisting the teacher, trying to help this woman do this very physically challenging practice, which is, I think, pretty unrealistic for middle-aged, somewhat overweight women or men. The overweight men couldn't do it either. And so she couldn't do it. And this Tibetan monk just said to her, "Oh, well, no problem. In your next life, when you're reborn as a man, you'll be able to do these practices." And that was the last time she ever studied with that whole teaching situation. She left. She just said, "I'm out of here."
Yeah, completely understandably, with that kind of statement in supposedly a teaching where women are equally as capable, per the Buddha, of attaining enlightenment.
Well, and I'm sure that this young Tibetan monk thought that he was, saying something comforting and accurate. But I once asked, there's not too many women teachers in the Tibetan tradition, as you know. Many years ago, I asked one of, not the woman I study with now, but a different woman teacher, what about the practices and the prayers for women to attain rebirth as a man? And she just kind of looked at me and she said, "You don't have to do those here in the West." And this was a older, very highly trained but older Tibetan woman teacher, and there was a demeanor about that too that carried and you people are it's good that somebody finally figured this out.
Rita, can you tell us a bit about your upcoming book, Others, Identity and Integrity: Surviving Religious Diversity?
Well, I'll try to tell you a little bit about it. I'm primarily known for the work I've done on gender in one way or another, but there are several other issues I've put a lot of energy into, and one of them is how to live well with religious diversity. I was brought up in a very fundamentalist version of Christianity that really was sure that everybody except them were going to go to hell. And that didn't sit very well with me, and I've always had a very strong aversion to people who think we have the only way. And, Buddhists get into that too. So I'm working people usually call it a theology of religious diversity. There's been a lot of Christian work done on this, and I've worked a lot with Christians who are concerned about these issues. But it hasn't been that passionate an issue for many Buddhists because in many ways Buddhism just doesn't have as many problems with religious diversity as Christianity does. So I'm working with this problem issue. The subtitle is, Surviving Religious Diversity. That's what we're about, is to talk about how to actually not regard religious diversity as a problem. Why do people regard religious diversity as a problem? And I've run into many people who are very positive about cultural diversity or racial diversity or gender diversity, but when it comes to religious diversity, they don't have a clue. They're not interested. They don't care. And actually, it's religious diversity that has caused a huge amount of suffering in the world for endless years. So what I'm suggesting in this book is that the way to survive religious diversity well is to know how to think well about others, people who are different from us. And my primary point there is that, in fact, self and other are co-created, that they don't exist independently of one another, which is a pretty Buddhist point of view.
Yeah, very much so.
And then identity, how do we think about our own identity? We think we have a solid, fixed identity, but that, in fact, is not the case at all, which is, again, a very Buddhist point of view. And then integrity, the final part is integrity, which is working with education and dialogue and other ways of actually training people so that they are not so frightened by others and that they have a much clearer sense that they don't have such a fixed permanent identity. And I think here one of the key solutions is the course in world religions, the course that I taught at the university endless, countless times. I have a kind of a slogan that I think it's an ethical responsibility of everyone who lives in a society that's as religiously diverse as ours is. Everyone has an ethical responsibility to know almost as much about at least one other religion as they do about their own. And how do you get that? You get it, I think the easiest way is actually through neutral academic university training. Many people are very pro-dialogue, but I think dialogue can be difficult and dangerous, whereas the neutral setting of an academic classroom is a very, very good place to learn about a different religion. And it's much less threatening in many ways. But dialogue is also important. So that's that book. And then the other project I'm working on these days, working on almost full-time sometimes, is a project I'm calling Buddhist History for Buddhist Practitioners. I've been teaching at Lotus Garden in Virginia, which is Judson Kanda Rinpoche's North American Center. I'm just going to go into my fourth year of teaching what I like to call an accurate and non-sectarian history of Buddhism at this Buddhist meditation center, which is quite a big step because most meditation centers only teach sectarian history. They don't teach accurate, non-sectarian history informed by the results of historical scholarship. And I've just also finished a short article on that project, which is going to be in the next issue of Tricycle. So I've still got a couple of big projects left to finish if I live long enough to do it.
There seems to be a resurgence of an interest in the more historical, verifiable, what does the archaeology say, and all that history of Buddhist practice. Is there any particular reason you're seeing this more now than we may have, say, 30 years ago?
Well, I'm not so sure we're seeing it myself based on the reaction of students at Lotus Garden when I try to teach them that Mahayana Buddhism is not the original form of Buddhism, which is very shocking news to them. Mm-hmm. But partly it's because we've just learned so much about Buddhism in the last 30 years. I mean, as I said, in the late 60s when I was first starting to study Buddhism, the books, we had very few books and very few, I mean, there just weren't that many good books. And now there's hundreds, thousands of very good books on Buddhism. There's just so many translations have been done. So many people are specializing full-time in Buddhist studies, so many more. There are so many more Asian teachers around. It's so much easier to get to Asia and actually see the places where Buddhism is thousands of years old. So I think it's, a tremendous increase in the information we have available to us, makes it a lot easier. I mean, I couldn't have begun to do the project I'm doing on Buddhist history for Buddhist practitioners 30 years ago because the translations and the archaeology and the painstaking historical work just hadn't been done yet.
Rita, as a reminder to other people who will be listening in, that we will be linking your books on the episode page for this episode. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's been a lot of fun, and I hope that a few people learned a few things and will carry on and explore further. This material is endlessly fascinating to me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.